This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Kaweco Caramel Brown. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll also take a look at a writing sample that I did on copy paper, and I'll also take a look at a couple of similar brown inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. Kaweco Caramel Brown came off the glass nib of my dip pen a little inconsistently. It came off the nib slow at times and then faster at others. The ink had no trouble coming off my tweezers to do the swatch. The swatch is nice and crisp, and you can see from the swatch that there's quite a range from dark to light, and there's a nice little bit of halo here on the dot where I lifted up the tweezers. I'm going to begin my writing sample with a Pilot 78G with a stainless steel extra fine nib. It looks good. The legibility is very nice in this extra fine nib. I wouldn't say that it's smooth or enjoyable to use, but it's not scratchy, so it is fairly well suited for like a little planner like this or anything that has these little small grids. So I'm going to put not scratchy. Next I've got a Quebeco Skyline Sport. It also has an extra fine stainless steel nib, but this is a Western extra fine, so it runs a little broader than the Japanese extra fine. And even for a Quebeco, this is a little on the broad side. A bit of a hard start there, and that's not unusual for this pen. I find that it tends to have just minor hard starts. It feels nice, and in this short little writing sample, it's putting down a nice amount of ink, but I can tell just from this short amount of writing that it is getting drier as I write, and that's an issue that myself and others have had with some of these Kaweco Sports. And I've noticed this before in a similar ink that I've used, Graphon Faber-Castell Hazelnut. That's an ink that I got years ago when I got this pen. It was one of the first inks I ever bought, and I noticed the same thing with that ink. Next, I'll be using a Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. It's very pleasant and smooth. Next I have a Twisby Mini with a stainless steel fine nib. This is very nice. It's not as smooth as the Custom 74 was, but I really like the writing experience in this fine Twisby nib. I haven't been using this pen much recently. I used to use it a lot at school because it had a nice ink capacity, and it was just a comfortable pen to use, nothing spectacular. But this ink paired with this pen, there's just something about it. Well, It doesn't look like it here, but this nib tends to feel a little on the dry side with some inks. I don't know. It's just not a standout nib. There's there's other nibs that I prefer over this one, but with this particular ink, it's just very comfortable. In fact, I'm looking forward to using this ink with this pen. The brown and the blue I think look nice together, and it's just very pleasant to write with. Next, I've got my Quebeco AL Sport. It's the golden espresso finish. In fact, this is one of the things that interested me in this ink. This ink had been suggested to me from several people, and the fact that I have this brown Kaweco pen to try it with, there was a bit of a hard start there. And I just have to say, let me see how wet it is. It's okay wet. It had quite a long smear, but I don't know. It doesn't look like there's much ink there. It's okay. I was really surprised. I liked the Twisby better. If I ever do use this brown ink with my brown AL Sport, I'll probably put the 14 karat gold nib in it, which is a little bit wetter and a little bit smoother. This was just, it wasn't unpleasant. It wasn't an unpleasant writing experience, but there are other pen and ink combinations that were just more enjoyable. This was just eh. Next, I'll be using my Pilot Pluminix that I've installed a stainless steel CM nib. It's also called a stub nib. I think it's the same thing as the stub nib that's used in the Prera. Sometimes this nib is iffy. Sometimes it's pretty dry, but if you can see, compared to the Quebeco, it's got some decent wetness, and it's nice and smooth. It looks nice. Sometimes inks can look a little washed out in this nib, but I like this. This is nice. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput, and it's got a stainless steel broad nib. That is glassy smooth, and it's decently wet, but not so wet that it comes out just monochrome dark brown. I'm getting some, it looks like some nice shading here. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 that I have put a 1.5 stub nib in it. Looking a little dry in the ink smear, but in the writing it looks decent. It looks like the ink was able to grab the paper okay. That's not going to be the case in some of the other writing samples. While that dries, let's take a look at the writing sample from the copy paper. I did not like the copy paper for this writing sample, and I don't know if it's perhaps my hand has rested on this section of the paper when I was doing the other writing samples, because these previous two writing samples have both been uncharacteristically unpleasant. The ink's not wanting to grab the paper. Seeing the 1.5 stub here, it had trouble getting started. you know, where it wanted to grab the paper. It's almost like the ink is beating up on the paper, not wanting to grab it. And you can see I've got sad faces by most of these. On the Pilot Custom 74, it was a little bit better, but I put a question mark because it still wasn't great. Legibility wise, it looks okay. Well, even here on the Pilot, you can see it's a little bit wispier than when it eventually grabbed the paper and started writing a little better. The Kaweco Sport with that extra fine nib, it was okay, but the Pilot extra fine was kind of scratchy. Now, Kaweco Caramel Brown, on my swatch that I did with the tweezers, like I mentioned before, there's a pretty good range between dark and light in the swatch. Let me get up here a little closer so you can see the halo. The sheen, I guess if you lay it down heavy enough, I would call that a black sheen, possibly. And there's, on the wider nibs, my lighting's not the best here today, there's a little bit of a halo to them. But this, I would call this a true brown. It doesn't make me think of caramel though. And the inks in my collection that were similar were Sailor 50 Stage, which also has quite a big range from dark to light, but it's got a little more yellow in it. So when you compare those two, you see more of the yellow. And SBRE Brown perhaps has even more yellow or orange to it. You can see SBRE Brown has more of a silvery sheen, but it doesn't shade quite as dark as these two, but you can see how the writing compares. You can see from the Kaweco Caramel Brown, it's the darkest. Sailor 50 States Texas is a little bit lighter, and then Ackerman SBRE Brown is even lighter still. In my water resistance test, you can see there was absolutely no water resistance. Okay, on my Tomoe River writing sample, let's look at the back of this page. It wanted to come through just a little bit on the swatch, but even with the glass dip pen with the scribbles and on the wider nibs, no trouble with bleeding through, and very legible and very, when you hold it back, very uniform in color, even though some of these are putting down more ink than others. You can see the Pilot Pluminix looks a little darker. I like how the AL Sport looks, but it felt a little dry. The AL Sport and the Twisby Mini look similar. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but here in the loop-de-loop, you can see a little bit of the shading. I think that's part of the reason I like these two so much. Just a little bit of shading to make it look interesting. I like the Twisby Mini even more than the Custom 74. The Custom 74, that gold nib was nice and smooth and it was pleasant to write with, but I like how it looked in the Twisby Mini, and it just felt good writing with the Twisby Mini also. Uncharacteristically nice. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.